Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of fashion and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. Today I'm back with another solved case to discuss with you guys. For today's video, we're going to be discussing the solved case of POLLY Klass, and I have personally never heard of this, but when I kind of stumbled across it in my research, I realised that it is quite a big case. I believe there's a lot of information, so I have a lot to get through, so it's probably going to be a long video, but it's also kind of well known, I believe, but I mean, not personally with me. So let me know if you guys have heard of this case before, but I thought I would discuss it with you guys anyway, because there might be some of you who haven't really heard of the case like me. Before we get started, I'm just going to zoom through my usual disclaimer. By any means am I not claiming to be an expert in this case, nor any of the cases that I cover on my channel. I am simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research online, which means that I'm not able to access every piece of information. So I apologise if I get anything wrong, miss anything out, or mispronounce anything. I'm not trying to do anyone any injustice or offend anyone. I'm simply doing the best I can with the research that I have access to. So if I do get anything wrong or miss anything out, please feel free to nicely comment it down below. But just so you guys know that we do not tolerate any negativity on this channel, and no nastiness, no awful comments as I received in the past, so just please keep the comments a positive place. I know some of you guys really do not like long intros, but this is kind of my only time where I can talk about updates that might interest you guys. So in the description I will have a link to my request a case where you can leave any case requests, as well as my Patreon if any of you angels want to be super lovely and donate anything to help the production of these videos. As well as, I just thought I'd let you guys know that I will be attending Summer in the City this year. If you haven't already seen, Summer in the City is very close. By the time this video goes up, I think it'll be maybe about less than a week away. So I will be there all weekend from the Friday to the Sunday, and I have a meetup with your favourite true crime YouTubers. So I'm doing a meetup and a panel with George Marie, Ellen O'Neill and Joshua Miles. So if you haven't already got your tickets and it sounds like something you'd enjoy, then definitely do so, because all your faves will be there. And I mean, aside from our meet and greet and panel, we will be about the convention the whole weekend meeting you guys. So it would be amazing if any of you guys are there to say hello, take some photos, have a chat with you guys. I would love that. So just thought I'd let you know in case you hadn't seen on any of our social medias. And with all that being said, we shall just get into discussing the case of POLLY Klass. POLLY Hannah Klass was born on January 3rd in the year of 1981 in a place called Fairfax in California in the United States. From a very young age, POLLY showed an interest and a talent in all things performance related. She was a very talented young girl. She showed a special interest in all things kind of singing and dancing, and she was always performing in her school's productions, and she wanted to pursue acting as a career in later life. When POLLY was almost 3 years old, her mother Eve and her father Mark decided that they were going to get a divorce, which was in many senses a very amicable and almost admirable divorce. The entire process wasn't messy and they remained very, very close friends, and there didn't seem to ever be any issue in terms of custody. POLLY went to live with her mother full time, and her father never failed to visit her when he was supposed to. They spent a lot of time together, and so POLLY grew up with two very healthy families. She got to see both her mother and her father plenty, as well as their family, their extended family. POLLY and her mother moved around quite a lot in her early years, and as a result it meant that POLLY didn't really have the easiest time making any long-term solid friendships, since she was constantly moving schools, making new friends, that she could never really build any stable long-term relationships with anyone. And so she was quite shy all in all, because she was constantly having to uproot her life. But she is still remembered, despite being quite a shy girl, she was remembered as being very lovely and very friendly to everyone that she met. And then a few years later, POLLY's mother Eve met a man named Alan Nicol, and the two soon fell in love and were wed. Alan brought 3 new children into the family from his previous marriage, and POLLY was said to have gotten on extremely well with all of her new step-siblings. However, this couldn't really be said the same for her relationship with her new stepfather. So POLLY didn't typically respond well if Alan tried to discipline her, and they would often kind of butt heads, they would often argue quite a bit. She just seemed to not really listen to him. She didn't really like to obey him. But to my knowledge, this never became physical or overly aggressive, simply just her not being a huge fan of her new stepfather. And then in the year of 1987, Eve and Alan welcomed their first child together into the world, a little girl named Annie. POLLY had a notably strong relationship with her biological father Mark and his parents. Their names were Joe and BJ Klass, and they would often take POLLY on short trips, kind of like weekends away. They spent quite a lot of time together, despite the fact that she was living with her mother full time and that Mark was no longer living with either of them, no longer married to Eve. And Polly basically had a new family essentially. Her mother had gotten married and there were loads of new kids that she was living with, but she still remained extremely close with her father and his family. One source I read quoted Polly's grandfather, his name was Joe, who was obviously her biological father's father, saying, "Polly spent most holidays and weekends with her dad, who ran a Hertz rent-a-car office in San Francisco's Fairmont Hotel. Wherever Polly's family moved, Mark Klass was there. He worked as a teacher's aide in some of Polly's schools and they had an incredible relationship." Polly's case takes place in the year of 1993 when Polly was just 12 years old. At this point, she was living in a place called Petaluma in California in the US with her mother and younger sister Annie, as her mother Eve had just recently separated from her second husband Alan Nickel. Polly was attending the local Petaluma Junior High School where she was known to be very, very well behaved and a very friendly student. On October 1st, 1993, Polly's mother decided that it would be a good idea to let Polly organise a sleepover for her and her friends from school, and these two girls' names were Kate McLean and Gillian Pelham, Polly's best friends. On that evening, Gillian had been the first to arrive at Polly's home, and so the pair decided just to wait outside of Polly's house, outside the front door in the front garden, for Kate to arrive so that they could all kind of walk in together and start their night together. At around 8:30 p.m, Kate and her mother arrived outside of Polly's house, following which Kate's mother decided to walk them up to Polly's front door and say their goodbyes for the night. The three girls were honestly so excited about this slumber party, and they planned on staying up all night doing all these fun things. I honestly remember how excited I used to get when I'd plan all these like fun sleepovers with all of my friends when I was younger, and just kind of saying all the things we were going to do to try and stay up as late as possible and all the things we'd eat and watch. And it was just such a vivid memory from high school, and it really makes it hit hard, the thought of this poor young girl having her life taken away at such a fun and early point in her life by some awful person that decided to do things just based on their own awful agenda. These three girls weren't alone in Polly's home that night, as Polly's mother was there just to kind of keep an eye on them and make sure that they had everything they needed throughout the night. Unfortunately, on this night, Polly's mother was suffering from quite a severe migraine, and so once she kind of said hello to the girls, making sure that they'd gotten all settled and had everything that they needed, she said that she'd go to lie down in bed for a bit, maybe just turn the lights off to try and ease her pain from her headache that she was suffering from. Eve had known that having these three 12-year-old girls in her house on a sleepover, all excited with all of these like sugary snacks and all this music and games and everything, she knew that they were going to be nothing but noisy, and she was fine with it even despite having such a painful headache, and she was extremely happy just to let them enjoy themselves. You know, they were there to have a good time and she would just kind of leave them to it. But then at around 9:45 p.m. that same night, Polly's mother did feel the need to kind of poke her head in the room and just to tell them to maybe start easing up the noise, being aware that they have neighbours, as well as that it's getting quite late and they would kind of have to start thinking about winding down a little bit for the night. But she said herself that she didn't really expect them to be all that quiet because, you know, like I'd said, they are three 12-year-old girls having fun on a sleepover together, so she just wanted to give them a warning that they should maybe be a little bit more considerate, but again left them to kind of have fun together. Because of this, as well as the fact that her bedroom was literally just across the corridor from where the girls would be staying that night in Polly's bedroom, Eve decided that she would take a couple of sleeping pills just to help herself get to sleep once she knew that the girls were settled and that they, you know, knew where everything was, had everything they needed, and since she had such a bad headache, it just seemed like the right thing to do at the time. This is obviously a decision that she has since been criticised for. However, she knew where the girls were, and she also knew that they had everything, like I keep saying, have everything they needed. They also knew everything is in the house. They knew how to find her and wake her up if they needed anything or if there was anything wrong. They knew how to contact like emergency services. They were 12 years old. They know how to look after themselves. And like I said, they were able just to grab her straight away if they needed anything. Plus, at this point, it also wasn't really even considered possible that someone could just enter the safety of your own home to kidnap someone. And so it hadn't even really crossed anyone's mind that this is a possible scenario when leaving three 12-year-old girls in their bedroom thinking that they're completely safe. They just didn't really cross people's minds. But sadly, on this fateful night of October in 1993, this is exactly what happened. After Polly's mother had gone to sleep, the girls continued to kind of have fun and be a little bit noisy for another maybe hour-ish, and it was at this point that they then decided they wanted to start practicing some kind of makeup and costumes for Halloween. As they were looking forward to their Halloween celebrations at the end of the month, they wanted to kind of plan out some different looks that they could potentially have for whatever they were doing at that Halloween night. So the girls were trying on loads of different makeup looks, they were trying on loads of different outfits to see what they could do, just have a little bit of fun really. And this was when Polly decided that she would run towards the front door and grab all of the girls' sleeping bags that they'd left kind of by the door as they came in earlier that night, and bring them into her bedroom so they can kind of start setting up for bed and getting chilled, you know, winding down a little bit once they'd had their fun. So picture these girls are inside Polly's bedroom together with the door shut. Polly begins to head for the door, she turns the handle, pulls it towards her, only to find a large, strange man stood in the doorway of her bedroom. In one hand he was holding a large knife, while in the other hand he was holding a duffel bag. And the first thing the girls hear him say is him threatening them that he would hurt any of them if they made a noise, if they attempted to scream or contact anyone. He was clearly aware that they weren't alone in the house, so he made sure that they were to remain quiet while he was in their bedroom. So not as to alert anyone, but as well as this, he also was aware that they weren't alone in the house because he managed to stay quiet enough that he could just stand outside of Polly's bedroom door so silently that no one else in the house heard him. And this is especially highlighted by the fact that Polly's mother's bedroom is literally facing Polly's, so he must have been completely aware of who else was in the house and where they were, because he was quiet enough to not alert anyone. It's known that at first Polly's friends weren't actually afraid. They kind of giggled a bit and they actually thought it was some sort of prank, that someone was playing on the girls and that Polly was, you know, in on it, that she knew whoever it was and they were wearing some sort of costume here to kind of try and scare the girls a little bit. Since they had been trying on like all these Halloween looks and things, they just thought maybe it was Polly's family or neighbour or friend or someone that was playing a trick on them. However, this was not the case, and Polly knew straight away that they were in danger since she did not recognise the stranger stood in her bedroom. And very quickly the other girls had this realisation the second that they noticed Polly wasn't laughing, she wasn't playing along, and this is when the fear set in. The man says to the girls, "Who lives here?" To which Polly replies, "I do," and he responds by saying, "I'm just doing this for the money." And because of this, Polly instinctively begins offering him money that she knows is hidden in certain locations of the house. She knows maybe there's some cash in her mother's handbag. She says there's a specific box that's hidden in the home that contains $50 in cash. She points him towards it, says, you know, go take that, as she obviously just assumed that he was likely a robber that had no intention of hurting them. However, despite him previously saying that he's only in it for the money, he begins to refuse to find any of the money that she's offering him, saying that he isn't interested in it, and he instead instructs the girls to lie down on the floor, and this is when he proceeds to tie their hands behind their backs and place makeshift hoods over their heads. He repeats himself again at this point, saying, "I'm not going to hurt you, I'm just doing this for the money." Polly frantically attempts to plead with the stranger. She begs him not to hurt her mum or her sister, and this is when the intruder aggressively pulls Polly up off the floor, but bearing in mind she is still tied up at this point, and he tells the other two girls to count to 1,000. And the two girls obviously did as they were told, for they were in complete fear of their lives. And the two girls obviously did exactly as they were told. They were in complete fear for their lives. And this is when the man walks out of the room with Polly in tow. The second Kate and Gillian heard the two leave the house, they both begin frantically trying to free themselves and each other from the binding that this man had placed them in, and they were eventually able to set themselves free and run for help. At around 10:45 p.m, Eve woke up to the two young girls panicking and telling them of what had just happened, and this is when Eve immediately dialed 911 for help. Law enforcement sprung into action upon receiving word of what had happened. In cases like these, time really isn't on their side, and so obviously they had no idea who this man was or where they were heading, so they immediately had to set out some sort of search party in hopes of finding Polly. A group of officers was dispatched immediately from the Petaluma Police Department in hopes of them searching the surrounding areas with the aim of finding either Polly, her abductor, or any sign of where they were headed. Kate and Gillian were very quickly able to provide kind of quite a frantic description of the man that they'd encountered. Obviously they were very, very distressed at this point, so they did the best they could. So all they could tell the police at this point was that they were looking for a Caucasian male in dark clothing, rather tall with a beard and quite unkempt looking. This description was broadcast out on police radio, so any on-duty officer was able to know what to look for, as it was obviously quite a large search in these first few hours. However, it wasn't actually broadcasted on every station and signal, and this would become an extremely important fact later on in the case. Fast forward to midnight that very same night, a woman named Dana Jaffe rang the local police department. Fast forward to midnight that very same night, a woman named Dana Jaffe ran the Petaluma Police Department, unaware of the search that was happening for the 12-year-old girl that had gone missing, but rather she was calling after hearing of a trespasser on her property just 25 miles away from Polly Klass's home. Earlier that evening, 19-year-old Shannon Lynch had been babysitting for Dana Jaffe's daughter, and when Dana returned home, Shannon set off on her drive home out of Dana's property. As Shannon was driving towards the outskirts of Dana's property, she noticed a car that seemed stuck in a ditch and a tall stranger wearing dark clothes heading towards her car, attempting to flag her down. Shannon remained in her car, obviously it's a safety precaution I guess, and she rolled down her window just the tiniest crack, just enough to talk to the man through the open gap. This man immediately put his hand through the crack of the window and kind of grabbed hold of it as though he was trying to hold on to the vehicle, and this is when he says to her, "I'm stuck, I need some rope." But Shannon felt quite uneasy. Something about the man just didn't seem right with her, and so she didn't really feel safe enough to get out of the car and help this stranger. She made some kind of brisk remark about how she didn't have a rope and that she couldn't really help him, and she quickly drove away from the man to the nearest payphone to alert Dana of the man that was on her property. At this point, Dana was at home with her daughter. The pair were alone, and when she had learned of this strange man that was on her property trespassing, she just didn't feel safe enough just to, go to bed and hope that he leaves. So she decided to grab her daughter, grab a bat, some mace, and they got into their car and drove past where the man was reported being stuck in his car to the nearest payphone to ring the police. As they drove away from their home towards the outskirts of the property, the car that Shannon had reported seeing and warned her of with the strange man lurking around it was there, but there was no one around the car. She saw no one. And Dana didn't stop. She continued just to pass by the car, slowing down just a little bit to see if there was anything, anyone around the car, anyone inside the car, if there was anything wrong. And then once she couldn't see anyone, she just continued to drive out of her property to the nearest payphone. They proceeded to call the police, following which 2 deputies from the Petaluma Police Department were dispatched to inspect this trespassing claim. And when these 2 deputies arrived at the abandoned vehicle, they came face to face with a man who was named Richard Allen Davis. According to this man, he'd been driving his car late at night when he'd driven into a ditch accidentally on this dark road and gotten his car stuck. The deputies noted that he was particularly scruffy and dirty, even with sticks kind of stuck in his hair, and he was extremely sweaty despite seeming like calm. He wasn't worn out, like he hadn't been running, but he was still overly sweaty to the point that they noticed it and felt the need to report it. They had inquired about what his purpose was driving out in this area, to which Davis replied that he'd just been out sightseeing and then he stumbled upon this kind of dark road and that he wasn't initially aware of it being private property. The deputies weren't entirely trusting of his story, considering it was an extremely isolated and eerie area. It's kind of unlikely just to stumble across it, and it is also just a generally unusual area to be found in, or just to happen to find yourself in late at night. This, combined with his strange appearance, it just seemed a little bit strange to these 2 deputies, so they decided to kind of stick around and ask him a few more questions. This man did, however, remain extremely calm and collected throughout the entire conversation that he had with the 2 men, and so because of this fact, despite his appearance, despite where he was very, very calm and sure of himself, so it kind of made him relatively believable in what he was saying. But then during their conversation, Davis very calmly and unexpectedly reached into his car. So on the passenger seat, he just reached in, grabbed out a can of beer and opened it and began to drink it in front of the 2 deputies. He finished the can while the deputies were there face to face with him, repeatedly saying that he couldn't drink that out in public in front of them, to which his response was to launch the can into the nearby bushes, following which they obviously instructed him that he needed to pick up his litter. When they were handed his driver's license, they were able to check to see if there were any outstanding warrants for Davis at any point, to which there were none. However, another factor that would later become extremely vital in the case relating to Polly Klass's disappearance is that this check that they were able to do on driver's licenses would not have actually informed them of a general criminal background. So if he had any background with any criminal activity, it wouldn't show up immediately unless they actively searched for it, which they have since said they didn't at that time typically do on potential trespassing incidents. It would later be known that Davis actually had previous convictions for a number of charges, including burglary, robbery, assault, and kidnapping, as well as the fact that he was presently on parole and his actions would at this time have been violating it. So yeah, as I said, it's kind of important to note that at this time the officers would actually have to actively attempt to search his criminal background with his driver's license, which they wouldn't typically do when responding to a potential trespasser, as opposed to this background check being done almost automatically when a license is checked, as it typically would nowadays. So a little background information into Richard Allen Davis himself. He was born on June the 2nd of the year 1954 in San Francisco. He was born the middle of 5 children to his parents named Bob and Evelyn Davis, who both allegedly had quite severe drinking problems and would often use brutal violence as a form of discipline for all of their children. When he was 11 years old, his parents divorced, following which Richard and all of his siblings went to live with their father in his full time. When he was 11 years old, his parents decided to get a divorce, following which Richard and all of his siblings went to live with their father full time. As he grew up, his father remarried numerous times, with Richard hating essentially every new wife that his father brought into the home, all contributing towards his overall hatred and negative opinions towards women. So he had a very, very unhealthy image and opinion towards women stemming from early life. It's also believed that his father had a number of undiagnosed psychological issues, as one incident in particular saw him running outside, basically shooting at the air with his shotgun, kind of having really, really vivid hallucinations. And so it appears that from a very young age, Richard did not have any kind of stability or any security in his life. And then as he began to grow up, so still as quite a young child, he would begin to capture animals and torture them mercilessly before killing them, which, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is a huge red flag nowadays for people that need to be tested for psychopathy. But despite all of this though, he was an extremely responsible carer for all of his siblings, making it kind of even more concerning when he then began to steal and turn to crime as a means of relieving tension, as he described it. He never finished high school, as he dropped out when he was just 16 years old, and then when he was 17 years old, he joined the army at the specific request of a judge, but he was still carrying out minor criminal acts while he was in the army, and so once his superiors learned of this, he left with less than a dishonourable discharge, and he just served 13 months, so he really wasn't there long. The next huge landmark in his life came in the year of 1973, when Davis attended the party of an 18-year-old girl named Marlene Voris, who was friends with his old friends from high school. Marlene Voris had been throwing this party to celebrate her receiving her acceptance letter into the Navy, and virtually every conversation people had with her that night reported her being extremely excited for this new chance in her life, saying that she'd always wanted to go into the Navy, and so she spoke to everyone that night basically saying how excited she was to join the Navy. At the end of the party that night, everyone began to file out of Marlene's home, but then Davis actually returned back into the house, telling his friends that he'd actually forgotten something inside and that he'd just be a moment. And then just a few minutes later, a gunshot was heard coming from inside the house, and Marlene Voris was dead. She'd actually been found surrounded by a number of suicide notes, leading respondents to file a report claiming that it had been an act of suicide. But because of all these reports of all the people that had attended the party that night saying about how excited she was to join the Navy, you know, she'd thrown this party just because she had received her acceptance letter, people kind of began to speculate that perhaps Davis was actually responsible for Marlene's death, because it just seemed very unlikely at this point in her life for Marlene to take her own life. And this was never confirmed, and so Davis went on to carry out a number of criminal acts, including attempting to sell items he'd previously stolen and burgled from people's homes, crimes which, when he was caught, ended up in him receiving a 6-month jail sentence. Just a few months after his release from jail, he was caught attempting to carry out another burglary and served just under 2 years in prison, and at this point he was 21 years old. In the months following his release from prison in the year of 1976, he carried out his first known attack on a woman, and his victim was 26-year-old Frances Mays. She'd been walking to her car at around 6 p.m. on the evening of September 24th when she encountered Davis threatening her with a knife. He instructed her to get inside of her car but sit in the passenger seat. He took her car keys, began to drive her car, and at first she asked him if she'd wanted her money and her wallet. He told her that he did and took it from her, but then after he'd taken her money, he turned to her and said, I just got out of prison, someone is following me and I gotta get away. He continued driving till they were in an isolated area, following which he pulled over to the side of the road and exposed himself to her, saying, I'm going to count to 3 and you know what I want you to do. Frances panicked at this and proceeded to lunge at him, attempting to grab the knife that he was holding, threatening her with. She managed to slice her hand in the process. Despite injuring herself, amongst the panic she was able to open her car door and run away from her abductor, following which she was luckily able to flag down a man driving a car nearby, a man that just so happened to be an off-duty highway patrol officer on his way to begin his shift. This man's name was Jim Wentz, and upon hearing what had just happened to this woman, he decided to grab his gun and head in the direction of Davis. He happened upon this man that she described in her car and placed Davis under arrest. He was immediately taken to jail awaiting a court date to be set, when it was decided that they were going to send him to a hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. But in December of the year of 1976, he managed to escape the hospital. On the night of his escape, he managed to attack another woman, this time in her home. He had broken into Marjorie Arlington's house and hit her over the head while she was sleeping, and he only ran from her home when she woke up screaming. But he later claimed that he believed he was only doing exactly what she wanted. There was a voice inside his head that had told him that she wanted to be hit over the head, and that he was just doing as she wanted, as he was told. From here, he broke into a nearby animal shelter where he took some drugs, a shotgun, and plenty of ammunition. And then on December 20th of that same year, Davis held a woman named Marie Ellis at gunpoint and told her she was to drive him to Santa Rosa. However, she managed to drive away quick enough to escape him before he got into her car. The following day, in a place called La Honda, he burgled an empty home and took some clothes and jewellery, likely with the intention of pawning them. But during this burglary, he was actually spotted by a neighbour, and responders found him trying to hide behind a fence in the property. He was arrested, taken to trial, and a judge sentenced him to 1 to 25 years in prison for the kidnapping of Frances Mays, 2 years to life for the subsequent assaults, and then 6 months to 10 years for the burglaries. But despite all these different convictions, he actually only ended up spending 6 years in prison, with him being released on parole in March of the year of 1982. From here, he met a woman named Sue Edwards, who they very soon actually became extremely infatuated with each other, which was an extremely weird relationship, really. And they later began a life of crime together. They would carry out a number of crimes together, including drug dealing and robberies, and in the year of 1984, they robbed a woman named Selena Valrich, who had previous ties to Sue. They forced their way into her home while she was inside. They vandalised the place and attacked her in the process. They demanded that Sue was to accompany her to her bank, where she was to withdraw $6,000 and give it to them, and this is exactly what happened. They successfully did so. From here, with their money that they had just stolen, they headed to Washington to wreak more havoc, where they stole $4,000 from a bank and managed to escape the police entirely. In 1985, they were back in California, but a broken tail light on their truck led to a police officer pulling them over and discovering the outstanding warrants for them after their attack on Selena Valrich, and they managed to escape after he did a background check on them. Because of Davis's criminal past and previous criminal activity, he received a 16-year sentence, while Edwards only served 6 months in prison. Following her sentence, she actually met and married a man named Mike Morava, who would later turn up murdered. And Edwards' boyfriend at the time confessed to murdering her husband. He was arrested, while she actually received a $300,000 inheritance from her husband's death. With both of her partners arrested, with her husband dead and her boyfriend in jail with a large sum of money that she just inherited, she headed back to visit Davis in prison, and the pair got engaged. But before long, she called off their engagement, and as I'm sure you can imagine, Davis was not happy at all about this. And to cut a long story short, Sue Edwards ended up in prison for a number of different charges, with Davis volunteering to provide evidence in the testimony against her in court. Eventually, Davis was released from prison, and it seemed to be like he was turning into kind of a model citizen, even passing drug tests and meeting all of his parole meetings, as well as getting a stable job, so it seemed as though he was completely turning his life around. He was soon even able to afford his own car, a white Ford Pinto, which would ultimately be the car he was driving on the night of Polly Klass's disappearance. And back to Polly's case. So this man, Richard Allen Davies, who had been kind of approached in response to being a potential trespasser on a woman's property. So despite him seeming perhaps a little bit sketchy, there wasn't really anything that the deputies could arrest him on because he hadn't actually really done anything wrong. He'd claimed that although they believed he was a trespasser, he was there by mistake and there wasn't really anywhere they could prove this. He didn't seem drunk at all. He was able to speak coherently and provide kind of a realistic explanation for everything, and so it seemed like his story and everything just made sense. To their knowledge, they weren't able to really see any other intentions that he might have had being on Dana's property. He didn't know her, he didn't know really that her house was there, and so when they decided that it appeared as though he wasn't there to cause her any harm or anything, they went ahead and asked him to leave the property and continue on his way. And when they decided that he wasn't posing her or her daughter any threats, they decided to ask Dana herself if she wanted them to arrest Davis for a trespassing charge. And she told them no, she didn't want this, she didn't want to arrest him. She simply wanted him off of her property and gone to make sure that her and her daughter were safe. The deputies relayed this information and Davis didn't argue. However, he did simply point out, as he mentioned previously, his car was seriously stuck in a ditch and that he needed some help to set himself free before he could leave the property. Dana Jeffy actually provided the deputies with a chain that she had in her car, and they set out to help Davis free his car and let him go. And without even knowing it, these deputies will have just let a killer go free. In the early hours of the following morning, a forensic team were hard at work scouring the Klass home in hopes of finding any potentially helpful evidence that may lead to some sort of identity being provided for the kidnapper of Polly Klass, and they actually came across a palm print in Polly's room, one that would later be vital for confirming the identity of her abductor. On this day, hundreds of local residents set out as a search party in hopes of spreading the word and finding any new evidence, perhaps seeing if anyone had seen Polly or her abductor that night. They printed off thousands of posters with Polly's name and face all over and plastered them pretty much around the entire town, entire area, to try and spread as much word and awareness as they could. Also on the posters was a contact number for the police group specifically set up for any potential reports of Polly's sightings. Just 2 days later, the TV show America's Most Wanted actually featured Polly's case in hopes of kind of spreading the awareness even further, just in case any further out information could come about and help the case. And on this TV show, they also featured a sketch that was created by sketch artists using the descriptions that Gillian and Kate provided for the abductor that they encountered in Polly's room that night. So these sketches of the potential abductor as well as Polly's face were plastered everywhere. They were on supermarkets and lampposts, on windows, handouts in mailboxes, literally everywhere, and everyone in the area knew that they were hunting for Polly Klass. And I'm not even sure I can even do it justice describing just how big this search was. The entirety of Petaluma really were actively out searching for the young girl. They were all pulling up posters. They'd even made these little purple ribbons for everyone in the area to wear, as lilac was her favourite colour. So it was such a huge thing, and everyone knew the name and face of Polly Klass. And in these sorts of cases, despite the ending maybe not necessarily being the nicest, it's really nice and reassuring to see such a large group of people, even strangers to a lot of sense, all come together and fight for justice and help search for this poor young girl who had been abducted. And this case absolutely blew up when a number of huge celebrities began to show their support for the search for Polly Klass. Specifically, Winona Ryder actually posted a $200,000 reward for anyone who had information leading to the return of Polly. And I think this was such a huge case that stood out from all of the other missing children's cases that were occurring around the same time because of the fact that Polly was taken out of the comfort of her own home. And like I said at the start, this wasn't really a thought of scenario. People didn't really assume that this could happen. So Polly was quite safe in the company of two other girls, as well as her mother and her sister. And this strange man who didn't even know the family managed to sneak his way into her home and take her without a trace. It really wasn't considered a possibility for this to happen, and I think it really shook the public to the core as they felt fear not only for themselves and their children, but also for Polly and her family as well. I am sorry for the sudden change in appearance. I had to leave my camera charging overnight, but we shall just continue on with the case. As weeks passed with no updates in the case, the law enforcement decided that it was time for them to enlist the help of a very highly accredited forensic sketch artist who was kind of known for her ability to speak to witnesses and keep them very calm and get all these kind of details that they might not have initially remembered from the incident. So she was just known at being really good at kind of getting out these minute details that maybe hadn't been already discovered from the witnesses early on in the investigation. She spoke to Julian and Kate, and it was a particularly helpful meeting since weeks had actually passed since the incident at this point, and they had calmed down a lot since the first time they provided a description of the abductor. Obviously they had initially provided the description on the night of the disappearance and the traumatic event for them, so they were obviously very worked up, and so because it was such a traumatizing event for them, they may not have been able to see entirely clearly through all the panic. So this forensic sketch artist was able to kind of calm them down, help them remember things that they might have initially forgotten. Now that the trauma is kind of in the past a little bit more, they were able to provide an extremely detailed description of the man they saw that night, and this updated sketch was then broadcast everywhere as the man that they were looking for, who was responsible for the disappearance of Polly Klass. It's then known that in early October of 1993, so that same year, Richard Allen Davis was pulled over and arrested on a drunk driving charge, but sadly no one at this point of his arrest actually picked up on how similar he looked to the sketches that had been released relating to Polly's case. So sadly at this point no one recognised him, and he was soon released again and not really thought of again for quite some time. In the same month there was this huge benefit event that was held in Polly's name, kind of just to raise awareness for her case as well as all of the others like it, and there was even like big names. So Robin Williams was one of the comedy acts on the lineup for the event, and in total they raised around $12,000 to aid the event and the case. And all of this, so this big event had been organised by something called the POLLY Klass Foundation, which had been set up in the early days of the investigation following Polly's disappearance, in hopes of assuring that the best possible methods were used and all the best possible resources were being applied to the search of Polly Klass, and it officially became listed as a non-profit organisation in November of 1993, the following month after the benefit. And the next huge change in the case came in November of that same year. A man named Bill Rhodes was a man who was hugely involved in kind of the early days of the organisation that had been set up in Polly Klass's name. He'd also been very organised in the search party that had initially been created in the early days of the investigation itself. And he also owned a print shop in Petaluma, which was kind of the hub of where all of the posters with Polly's name and kind of face and all the information regarding her case, they were printed out in his shop and distributed across the area. So he was hugely involved in the early days of the case. And then in October of 1993, Bill Rhodes was actually named as president of the Polly Klass Foundation, which was the non-profit organisation. He was given this title by Polly's father kind of as a thank you, sign of his gratitude for all that he'd done in the case and helping to find Polly. But then in November of 1993, a set of very serious allegations came out against Bill Rhodes, which involved a woman claiming that he molested her multiple times when she was just a young child. And then it was also discovered that in the year of 1967 he was also arrested for masturbating in front of young children, and it was then discovered that in the year of 1967 he had been arrested for touching himself in front of young children, and then the following year he was arrested for holding 4 young girls at knife point and forcing them to undress in front of him. He had blindfolded and molested these young girls, but when this was taken to court, he was for some reason formally acquitted. So then back to 1993, these allegations then brought up the discovery of his past, all of these previous incidents involving minors, and it was then known that he was actually a registered sex offender. So these allegations back in 1993 were then brought up, and then it led to the discovery of his past with these previous allegations and arrests involving minors. Also led to the discovery that he was actually a registered sex offender. And what is kind of concerning is that this latter event that I spoke of is not entirely different from Polly's case. And it was at this point that public speculation began to discuss the possibility of Bill Rhodes, this man who had been in the centre of all of the investigation of every point in Polly's case, all of spreading the awareness and all helping out. Could he have potentially been the man who abducted her? It isn't unheard of for perpetrators of crimes such as these to almost enjoy being the centre of the investigation, trying to kind of take him down and bring him to justice, as they feel kind of like the satisfaction of being so close to the case that they only they know that they were capable of. And also by gaining the trust of those in charge of the investigation, but also give them the ability to kind of veer them in another direction, steer them away from him being guilty. So because of all this speculation, Rhodes was investigated thoroughly in relation to Polly's disappearance as a potential suspect, but he was ultimately ruled out entirely as having no involvement whatsoever. And some people claimed that during this kind of investigation into his potential involvement, he openly said that he had thrown himself into helping as much as he could in terms of Polly's case and the search for her, as a way of him making up for the things that he'd done in his past. And just when things in the investigation appeared to be going nowhere, on the 28th of November in 1993, Dana Jaffe, so the woman who had initially discovered Richard Allen Davies as a trespasser on her property, she'd been out on the outskirts of her property on a walk not far from where Richard Allen Davies had been spotted and gotten his car stuck. She came across a number of items that were partially hidden in the wooded area, and these items included a sweatshirt, a pair of tights in a knot, a condom wrapper with a condom found separately, strips of tape used for binding, and cloth that seemed like a makeshift hood. Dana Jaffe had said that these items, especially all together, just struck her as really concerning and almost like unsettling. In particular, the pair of tights that were kind of knotted, as well as the pieces like the strips of cloth, they were the first things that struck her to be really strange. And the first thing that she said sprung to her mind when she saw these items in particular was that they struck her as almost like makeshift gags. It was at this point she then remembered the trespasser that she'd found on her property those months before on the night of Polly's disappearance, and she considered the possibility of these items that she had just discovered and the trespasser as being related. She decided to ring the police and tell them of what she had found, as well as her concern that perhaps they might have been linked to the man that was discovered on her property and possibly Polly's case. This was all kind of going through her mind, these potential links, and they did agree that it was definitely worth them looking into. And it was at this point that they revisited the identity of the trespasser on Dana Jaffe's property, Richard Allen Davies. And from here, his previous criminal convictions became known to them. Upon bringing him in for further investigation and just kind of a collection of his personal details, they discovered that the palm print that he then provided them on this day actually matched the palm print found in Polly's room from her abductor. And when this was discovered, Richard Allen Davies was arrested for the abduction of Polly Klass. However, he refused to say anything. His guilt was then further confirmed when Kate and Gillian, Polly's two best friends, were able to confidently identify him as the man that they'd seen in Polly's bedroom that night. And then on December 4th of the year 1993, Davies told investigators that he was in fact guilty of the kidnap and the murder of Polly Klass. There is no way of knowing exactly what happened to Polly Klass on that fateful night, as the only word we have to go on is that of Richard Allen Davies himself. And Davies' story of that night goes as follows. He said his intention for the night had been to visit Petaluma to see his mother who lived there, but he wasn't able to find her home and he wasn't able to contact her either. While he was wandering around the streets of Petaluma, he came across a couple of young men who sold him some marijuana, but he claimed that when he'd smoked it, there was something wrong, they had laced it with something, and that his memory for the rest of the night was extremely foggy. He says he doesn't remember how he got to Polly's house or why he was there, but he vaguely remembers breaking into the home and couldn't remember why he chose her home in particular. The next thing he allegedly remembers is driving around for a while with Polly in his passenger seat, and then this is when he got stuck on Dana Jaffe's property. When he got stuck, he decided to untie Polly and walk her out into the heavily wooded area on Dana's property, and he told her to wait there, that he would come back for her. He claimed that at this point she hadn't been bound, he'd untied her in the car, and that after the time he'd returned to come and get her, so after being stuck in the ditch and struggling to get his car free, after speaking to Shannon, the babysitter who first spotted him on the property, and then speaking to the deputies that were sent to report on the trespassing claim, after all that time, he claimed that he went back to find Polly exactly where he'd left her, so she hadn't moved or tried to get help or anything. Investigators believe that this in particular is highly exaggerated, as he went as far as to claim that she almost seemed relieved when he came back to get her, which obviously is extremely unusual for a young girl who'd just been kidnapped. According to him, when he returned, she said, "I thought you had left me," which many believe would not be a likely scenario, and I do agree that is extremely unlikely. When Polly's remains were then found 2 months after this, there wasn't really enough to be able to determine a lot. So they couldn't determine if she'd been sexually assaulted just before her death, although she had been found with her legs spread and her skirt pulled up over her waist, so it is a likely scenario. In addition to this, there was also the opened condom that was found nearby on Dana Jaffe's property, so that kind of fits in with that same scenario. Although it is entirely possible, as some people have since argued, that this condom and the condom wrapper may just be kind of an unrelated piece of litter. According to Davis, he had strangled Polly using a piece of cloth which could not necessarily be supported due to the conditions of the remains that were discovered, but it is a likely scenario considering the items that Dana Jaffe had found on her property not far from where the whole thing took place. Richard Allen Davies was taken to court where a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances, and this meant that he was eligible to receive a death penalty as a result of an attempted lewd act on the child, since they were unable to actually prove that he carried out a sexual assault, but it was like an attempted assault. And on the day of his sentencing, the judge announced that he would be receiving a death sentence for his crimes. Richard Allen Davies, now 65 years old, remains on death row to this day for the murder of Polly Klass in the year of 1993. So that is everything I'm going to discuss today. This is obviously a very long case, there's a lot of details. It's kind of hard to research in a coherent manner because there is so much that isn't known in terms of what actually happened. So it's a solved case technically because we know who the perpetrator was, but apart from his account of that night, there is no way for them to say for sure what happened to Polly Klass. So sadly, this young girl lost her life, and it's awful. It's absolutely heartbreaking that this man, this absolute stranger as well, he had no ties to her or her family, just could break into the safety of her own home and abduct her and basically do what he want with her. It's awful, and I'm so glad that he has received some sort of punishment as a result, although he's yet to receive a date for his death sentencing. I hope you guys found this interesting. Let me know down below what your thoughts are, as well as leaving any of your case requests in the comments or in the link in my description. I have a request a case account where you can just kind of leave any of your specific requests for me to go through. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I will see you guys soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.